Africa has been a hotbed of conflict for the last century. As the colonial regimes of the Old World withered, the shadow of the Cold War enveloped the continent. Vast natural resources were discovered and weapons proliferated, providing the means for idealists and renegades to take power for themselves. Nigeria gained independence from Britain in 1960, but this statement isn't entirely accurate. What's closer to the truth is, in 1960, Nigeria was created. Nigeria's borders were set by the Anglo-French Convention of 1898, also called the Niger Convention, and were essentially a line in the sand between the British and French empires in Africa. The border existed to divvy up resources on the Niger River, nothing more. When the Nigerian state was established in 1960, it inherited those colonial borders. That meant inside Nigeria, there were over 100 separate ethnic groups, of which several also owned land across the border in Benin, Niger, and Cameroon. Imagine if you drew a 1,000 kilometer square over Europe and declared it a country. How would you govern this state? Where would the capital be? What language would you speak? This was essentially the dilemma facing Nigeria in 1960, but for them, it was far more complex. When the Brits initially claimed Nigeria, they backed up their threats with military force. But this wasn't permanent. It wasn't feasible to maintain a large garrison forever, so the colonial officials used money. They bought off key locals and had them maintain order instead. In Nigeria's north, which had traditionally been discovered by a strictly conservative Muslim hierarchy, this was easy. The dominant local group, the Hausa, were used to not having a say, and their lives changed little. In Nigeria's south, where the Igbos and Yoruba resided, things were different. Governance had traditionally been village-based and was akin to local councils. Anyone who wanted to could participate in this form of government, and consequently, the Brits found these areas much harder to control. Harder to control meant that the Brits established a stronger presence there, checking up on things, making arrests, and managing their interests. With them came Christian missionaries who converted much of the population. Before long, wealthy Igbo families were sending their sons to schools and universities in Britain. They were Christian, had plenty of money, and spoke good English, meaning they fit right into Britain, and many pursued top-level academic qualifications before returning to Nigeria. This wasn't the case for the Hausa in the north, who remained largely shielded from British influence. In the 1940s and early 50s, political parties formed from the highly educated and politically conscious Yoruba and Igbo peoples. In Nigeria's southwest, the Yoruba formed the Action Group in the west, or simply the AG, and in the southeast, the dominant Igbo formed the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons, or the NCNC. The Hausa jumped on the bandwagon too, forming the Northern People's Congress, or NPC, to control the northern parts of the country. Despite some of their similarities, a split existed between the AG and NCNC, particularly over Nigeria's capital. Lagos, the parliamentary seat, was a Yoruba town, and the AG didn't want to lose sovereignty over it if it became the country's official capital. The AG also wanted to enshrine a right of secession into the post-colonial constitution. The Igbo NCNC was firmly against this and pursued a platform of national unity at all costs. British colonial officials had stacked the parliament, so the less radical Hausa NPC always had the final say in issues such as these. In this case, they sided with the NCNC, and Nigeria's 1946 constitution did not allow secession. It also granted the Crown, which essentially meant BP Shell, exclusive rights over any oil found in the country. This would have deadly ramifications. Nigeria gained independence on October 1st, 1960, and exactly 3 years later became a republic. 1964 was an election year and tensions mounted. Workers' strikes around Lagos highlighted the inequality between ordinary people and politicians. The army was called upon to put the strikes down, and they did so with brutal efficiency. But the soldiers were ordinary people and began to resent the politicians whose orders they followed. Fraud was rampant in the election, and the Hausa NPC won a comfortable majority. They were happy to work with British companies, and soon, nearly half of Nigeria's export economy was run by BP Shell. The vast majority of this was from oil fields in the country's south, where the Igbo lived, and not in the north where the Hausa leaders came from. For the Igbo, it felt like they'd just swapped one colonial regime for another. They had to take action. In 1966, Igbo military officers launched a coup. They executed many of Nigeria's Hausa and Yoruba elite in the capital, but were not strong enough to seize power for themselves. The Igbo head of the Nigerian army, Johnson Agoye Aronsi, filled the vacuum. He seemed willing to work toward unification, but fatally failed to prosecute the Igbo coup plotters. In October, dissatisfied Hausa soldiers launched a counter-coup and killed him. This wasn't the end of the violence, far from it. In the north, soldiers massacred Igbos in the streets. American anthropologist Charles Kyle was in northern Nigeria at the time. He later recalled, "The intent of the soldiers, the only power that counts in Nigeria now or then, was painfully clear. After counting the disemboweled bodies along the Makurdi Road, I was escorted back to the city by soldiers who apologized for the stench and explained politely that they were doing the world a great favor by eliminating Igbos." To further punish the Igbos, the Hausa-controlled parliament split Nigeria into 11 states, deliberately cutting Igbos off from their oil fields in the process. With no legal path to secession, the Igbo-dominated southern region of Nigeria broke away, becoming the Republic of Biafra in May 1967. Nigeria blockaded Biafra immediately, declaring to the world that they were preventing Igbo forces from receiving arms shipments. While this hamstrung the fledgling Biafra army, the blockade's primary impact was a restriction of food and medical supplies. People in Biafra began to starve, and children suffered the worst. Nigerian statesman Obafemi Awolowo later said, "All is fair in war, and starvation is one of the weapons of war." It was a humanitarian crisis, a fully intentional one. Oil tankers were initially allowed through the blockade, but this ended when Nigeria discovered that BP Shell had paid taxes to the Biafran government, which contravened Nigerian law. The Six-Day War also broke out a week after the blockade began, and Middle Eastern oil wasn't passing through the Suez Canal. Global oil prices rose sharply. This was when everything changed. Genocides, pogroms, and widespread starvation are one thing, but messing with the world's, and more specifically Britain's oil supply is something else entirely. The world took sides. In return for a guarantee that BP Shell's infrastructure would remain private, Britain backed Nigeria. British intelligence officers began working for the Nigerian army and put the Nigerians in touch with arms dealers around the world. Despite the British PM declaring otherwise, the British gave the Nigerians 2 naval vessels and at least 60 armoured vehicles. BP Shell were also happy to pay oil-field royalties early so the Nigerian government had spare cash to spend on more British arms. On the flip side, London-based charities Oxfam and Save the Children were flying food supplies into Biafra to aid the starving population, working against the British government. Many other countries took a humanitarian stance and sent food supplies to Biafra. Among them were the Vatican, Canada, Sweden, Germany, and the US. As capitulation through starvation was Nigeria's goal, relief flights were targeted by Nigerian fighters. In June 1969, an International Red Cross DC-7 donated by Sweden was shot down while delivering aid. Before the war, Nigeria had no substantial air force, and both Britain and the US refused to sell them fighter aircraft. So how did the Nigerians shoot down the Red Cross plane? In the summer of 1967, the Soviet Union sold Nigeria 17 MiG-17s and provided them with 200 technicians. This was part of a broader mission to establish trade relations between Nigeria and the USSR. It worked, and Nigeria began purchasing more Soviet hardware. Training, however, was a different story. The inexperienced Nigerian air crews couldn't handle their new jets, so they subcontracted the Egyptian Air Force to fly them. To summarize, Egyptian pilots flying Soviet jets for Nigeria shot down an American-made International Red Cross plane donated by Sweden and delivering aid to Biafra. On the ground, things were just as confusing. French planners were keen to limit British influence in sub-Saharan Africa and were jealous of Britain's domination of oil resources around the Niger River. They championed the Biafran cause internationally, but refused to officially recognize the young country. Just like Britain, the French wanted to supply weapons, but they also wanted deniability. Luckily, they had the perfect solution. Thousands of World War II era German and Italian firearms were still sitting in French warehouses in the 1960s. By obliterating the serial numbers, these weapons couldn't be traced back to France. The Biafran Historical Research Centre was set up in Paris as a front to smuggle weapons to Biafra via nearby Gabon and Côte d'Ivoire. The Portuguese joined in too, smuggling weapons through French channels to Biafra to combat growing British influence in the region. Wanting in on the action, communist Czechoslovakia began selling weapons to the French, who imported them into Biafra too. But the Czechs stopped once the Soviets found out and decided the Eastern Bloc was supporting Nigeria. Like the communists, the Israelis supported both sides. They initially sold heavy weapons to Nigeria, but switched allegiance after people began likening the wholesale starvation of Biafran children to the Holocaust. Mossad funneled arms and cash to Biafra through clandestine routes similar to the French. But not all the world's communists were on the same page. China declared its support for Biafra, fighting against Anglo-American imperialism and Soviet revisionism by supplying over $2 million in weapons via Tanzania. Mercenaries were heavily involved too. They came from many places, drawn to Biafra by the promise of money and a good fight. They were funded directly by the Biafran government and, by extension, Biafra's international supporters. Despite a large presence in foreign media coverage of the conflict, Biafran leaders later argued the mercenaries did not help. It would have made no difference if not a single one of them came to work for the secessionist forces. In a way, the war was taken out of both Nigeria and Biafra's hands. Each side was reliant on foreign aid, and both promised foreign access to their rich oil fields to win over allies. With big players like Britain, the Soviet Union, and France at the table, whichever side acquired the most aid had a decisive advantage. In 1968, this was Nigeria. In June, Biafra was surrounded by Nigerian forces. Both sides continued to launch offensives throughout the war, but Biafran military was increasingly impacted by the growing humanitarian crisis. In December 1969, the Nigerians launched a major offensive that successfully split Biafra in two. A month later, the key Biafran population centers fell to further Nigerian attacks. The war officially ended on January 15, 1970. It lasted 2.5 years and cost between 45,000 and 100,000 soldiers their lives. Estimates vary, but it's likely that upwards of 2 million civilians were indirectly killed via starvation during the conflict. A similar number were displaced. The Igbo people still have not fully recovered, and many continue to face the lifelong consequences of acute childhood malnutrition. The old tensions remain deeply entrenched in modern-day Nigeria. In 2012, the separatist organization Indigenous People of Biafra was founded, and they continue to agitate for Biafran independence today. 2000, a British Special Forces unit infiltrated a village in regional Sierra Leone. The village was right on the edge of enemy territory, and the operators were expecting a fight. What they weren't expecting, however, was to find a platoon of Nigerian soldiers holed up there. With orders to defend the village and wait for reinforcements, the men had held their positions for months without resupply. Only days after the British arrival, these men were outnumbered and fighting to the death against a battalion of gangster rap fanatics. This is the fascinating story behind one of the strangest battles in modern military history. In 1991, a rebel group composed of largely disgruntled young men arose in Sierra Leone's countryside. Fed up with the established elites in the capital, Freetown, hoarding the nation's vast diamond wealth, they began a populist campaign. Named the Revolutionary United Front, the group wasn't affiliated with left or right-wing politics, nor with any ethnicity or religion. Their goal, as stated by their leader Fode Sanko, was no more slaves, no more masters, power and wealth to the people. Great in principle, but once Sanko controlled the diamond mines, he decided to keep the wealth for himself. Sierra Leone's economy promptly collapsed. To protect his newfound wealth and combat government forces, Sanko armed the RUF with weapons imported from allied rebel groups in neighboring Liberia. The RUF also began a terror campaign across the country, forcibly recruiting child soldiers and killing people indiscriminately. Infamously, they cut the hands, arms, and legs from nearly 200,000 Sierra Leonean civilians. They rationalized that amputees could not mine diamonds to support the government. After this had been going on for 8 years, the United Nations got its paperwork sorted out and decided to launch a peacekeeping mission. The United Nations mission in Sierra Leone, known as UNAMSIL, deployed in 1999 to enforce peace via violence. A large contingent of the soldiers fighting in UNAMSIL were seconded from the Nigerian army. Seen as tough, no-nonsense fighters, the Nigerians were welcomed by Sierra Leone's civilians. By July, the UN had brought the RUF to the negotiating table. They agreed to end the civil war and to bring back democracy. But once the UN backed off, the RUF started fighting again. In May 2000, the rebels blocked the road between Freetown and the airport, effectively besieging the city. Hundreds of foreign aid workers and civilians were trapped and at the mercy of the RUF. That's when the British got involved. British and Indian Special Forces led the charge into Sierra Leone. They first secured the airport, called Lunge, and began evacuating UNAMSIL personnel. Across the country, SAS operators and elite Gurkha troops from the Indian Army conducted hostage rescue operations and surgical strikes against RUF forces. This effectively splintered the more disparate parts of the RUF into separate factions. One of these splinter groups was the West Side Boys. Mostly comprising former child soldiers and led by an ex-army corporal that promoted himself to brigadier, the West Side Boys were obsessed with American gangster rap culture and renowned for their extreme cruelty. On May 10th, the Pathfinder platoon of 1 Para, which is essentially the British Paratroop Regiment's elite force, was deployed to the village of Lunge Lol. This settlement was an isolated pocket of civilization in the jungle and lay directly between a group of 600 West Side Boys and the airport. It was here, in Lungai Lol, that the Pathfinders ran into the Forgotten platoon. The Pathfinders arrived by Chinook, rapidly deploying from 2 aircraft and fanning out to secure the village. Intelligence on rebel movements was scarce, and they expected to be shot at as soon as they arrived at the landing zone. Eyes watched them from the trackless jungle, but no shots were fired. Within minutes, the Brits secured the village's perimeter and their Chinooks flew away. The men were on high alert, expecting an attack at any moment. Suddenly, a man appeared from a low hut. The man was tall and dressed in an immaculate green uniform. His boots were polished to a high shine and his shirt was pressed and starched to a T. Freshly shaven and sporting a pair of enormous shiny aviators, as well as a light blue UN beret, the man strolled casually over to where the Pathfinders were digging in. Sergeant Heaney remembered vividly what happened next. In an upper-class British accent, the man politely said, "Good afternoon, gentlemen. I'm Lieutenant Oronto Obasanjo from the Nigerian Army, forming up part of UNAMSIL, the United Nations peacekeeping mission here in Sierra Leone. You are most welcome. You are from which nation's military? Her Majesty's Armed Forces, if I'm not mistaken." Recovering from the immediate shock of such a friendly reception, Heaney handed Obasanjo over to his commander, Captain Harris. Mission-oriented and still on alert, Harris first got Obasanjo to brief him on Lungai Lol's geography, contact with the enemy, and about everything else a ground commander might want to know. Only later, once the trenches had been dug and the Pathfinders could see no attack was coming immediately, did Harris get Obasanjo's full story. Obasanjo and his 16-man platoon had been deployed to Lungai Lol 6 months before as part of the first wave of UNAMSIL soldiers. Since then, they had received no orders, no food supplies, no ammunition, no communication, and had not seen a single person from outside the village. In return for their security presence, the Lungai Lol villagers fed and housed the men. However, most had, quote, gone native. Heaney later recalled that the Nigerian platoon had basically been left marooned for 6 months, so at some point during that time, the guys themselves had got out of their uniform, put local gear on, married local girls, and were now part of the village. The soldiers believed that they had been abandoned by the UN and had begun new lives as Lungai Lol villagers. They wore sarongs like the locals and didn't carry weapons anymore. Only Obasanjo had faith that eventually the UN would come to relieve them. He maintained his uniform as well as he could and kept his weapon and equipment as clean as possible. It's hard to imagine how he would have felt when Harris told him the Pathfinders weren't his relief force. They were there to take the fight to the enemy. The West Side Boys knew British soldiers protected Lungai Lol, but they had seen only 2 helicopters fly in, informing them that the defending force was small. Believing their superior numbers and heavy weaponry would prove decisive, the West Side Boys decided to attack. They named their mission Operation Kill British, and their battle plan was equally creative. At around 0445 on the morning of May 17th, the West Side Boys' vanguard approached Lungai Lol. In the early morning darkness, one of the rebels let loose a battle cry and advanced on the village. Behind him was a column of 30 to 40 West Side Boys, all armed with AK-47s. The man at the front fired a single shot from the hip, but his rifle immediately jammed. Stopping to clear it, neither he nor the men behind him realized they were all in a kill zone. The Pathfinders and Nigerians had spent a full week preparing Lungai Lol's defenses. An influx of villagers displaced from other settlements by the West Side Boys provided a steady stream of intelligence, and the defenders knew exactly where the attack would come from. The Brits set up a forward trench backed up by 3 support trenches to the rear. They planned to bear the brunt of the attack, while Obasanjo's forgotten platoon covered the flanks. To back them up, the Pathfinders had 2 mortar pits in the village with 51mm mortars. When the West Side Boys leader stopped to clear his jam, 3 machine guns opened fire on him and his men. They were nearly all cut down. After their frontal assault failed, the West Side Boys flipped to page 2 of the World War I battle manual and started a heavy bombardment. For over an hour, they battered the defenses with rockets, mortar shells, and heavy weapons fire. Over the din, Obasanjo could be heard shouting encouragement to his men. All held their positions while the Pathfinder mortars did their deadly work. Firing illumination rounds and high explosives alternately, the mortars kept the battlefield lit up enough for the trench machine gunners and riflemen to hold the West Side Boys back. Several times they launched frontal assaults, but the defenders' withering fire kept forcing them back. After sunrise, the attack waned. The West Side Boys kept up sporadic fire into the defenses, but eventually pulled back, broken. They took some of their dead with them, but left at least 25 bodies on the battlefield. One villager had been hit by a ricochet, and the Pathfinder's medic tended to her wounds. There were no other friendly casualties. The defense at Lungai Lol had a cascading effect on the war in Sierra Leone. The West Side Boys broke up and joined other rebel groups, telling stories of the British Pathfinders and the forgotten Nigerian platoon. Morale across the RUF began to collapse, and the rebels began infighting. Within a few months, this infighting had destroyed the RUF's organization, and they no longer posed a significant threat to Sierra Leone. After 16 days in Lungai Lol, the Pathfinders left the same way they'd arrived. Back at the base in Freetown, they reported the village's situation to the UN officials. The UN officers had no idea there were Nigerian peacekeepers in the area and had stopped paying Lieutenant Obasanjo and his platoon months ago. But while the Brits left, Obasanjo remained. Still carrying out his order, he stayed with his forgotten platoon, keeping watch over the village of Lungai Lol. Africa has been a hotbed of conflict for the last century. As the colonial regimes of the Old World withered, the shadow of the Cold War enveloped the continent. Vast natural resources were discovered and weapons proliferated, providing the means for idealists and renegades to take power for themselves. Sierra Leone gained independence from Britain in 1961, and until his death in 1964, was led by the democratically elected Prime Minister Sir Milton Margai. Rich in diamonds, fish, coca, and minerals, Sierra Leone had large public coffers and strong institutions, but all it took was one man to bring it down. In 1968, Siaka Stevens was elected Prime Minister of Sierra Leone. He'd spent a lot of time since Sierra Leone's independence fanning the flames of ethnic conflict in the country's remote northern and eastern fringes. Riding on a ripple as opposed to a wave of populism, Stevens quickly set about destroying the democracy that elected him. He emptied the treasury to pay for small projects that benefited his close allies. He undermined and stripped away parliamentary powers. And he had political opponents exiled or executed by a corrupt judiciary. Public confidence in state institutions evaporated, and Stephen's reign came to be known as the 17-year Plague of Locusts. With the treasury empty, government officials looted and sold public property to pay their bills. Teachers in the publicly funded education system were forced to find other jobs, and the students were turned out onto the streets. Gang violence rose, and those with means left the capital, Freetown, for safety overseas. These people represented the country's professional classes, the doctors, lawyers, and engineers whose skills were difficult to replace. While Sierra Leone crumbled, its neighbor Liberia was involved in a bloody civil war. Weapons flowed into Liberia from other parts of Africa and the ex-Soviet republics. On the Sierra Leonean border, 80,000 refugees attempted to escape the violence. They were mostly children and were in desperate need of food, shelter, and medical care. In the regional and most disaffected areas, a rebel group called the Revolutionary United Front rose to challenge the government for control over the country. They initially enjoyed support from Sierra Leoneans desperate for change until word of their atrocities spread. Far from being a grassroots organization, the RUF formed in Liberia from brutalized soldiers serving the convicted war criminal Charles Taylor. In 1991, they recruited child soldiers en masse from border refugee camps, promising the kids food and medicine in exchange for blood. The unwilling were given a choice: join or die. The RUF rampaged through outlying Sierra Leone. Loot kept the men loyal, and they used violence to keep the child soldiers in line. In response, the Sierra Leone Army, or SLA, tried to hunt the RUF down. But corrupt officers withheld money and food from their men, and the government soldiers went on countryside looting sprees too. With both sides massacring civilians without cause, people could no longer tell the difference between the RUF and the SLA, who were supposed to be protecting them. They called the men Sobels, soldiers by day, rebels by night. A third faction then entered the fray. Named the Kamajors after a traditional group of expert hunters, these men were essentially a patriot militia. They guarded villages against both the SLA and RUF, though they were also involved with criminals. Many Kamajor militiamen came from street gangs, but as far as the civilians were concerned, they were better than the rebels and the army. By 1992, the RUF controlled 2/3 of Sierra Leone. The SLA had been totally ineffective in destroying the rebels and were now fighting the Kamajors too. As if that wasn't enough, there were problems back in Freetown. In 1991, the RUF captured transport hubs in the infrastructure poor south and east of Sierra Leone. The government-run diamond mines were cut off, and the regime's main source of wealth went with it. Money to pay both the SLA and the public service ran out. So, in April 1992, a group of SLA officers overthrew the government, establishing the National Provisional Ruling Council, or NPRC. They promised to bring peace to Sierra Leone, but peace had a high price. With considerable assistance from an ECOMOG contingent comprising Nigerian regulars, the NPRC pushed the RUF back to the border. By 1993, it looked like the war might be over, but the corrupt NPRC had neglected the SLA soldiers on the ground. Having gone without pay and food for weeks, large contingents of the SLA went renegade, joining the RUF. Bolstered by soldiers and supplies, the RUF renewed their offensive on Freetown. This suited the NPRC just fine, because the longer the war went, the longer they stayed in power. However, the strategy only works if you're on the winning side, and by 1995, with the rebels 20 kilometers from Freetown, the NPRC was in trouble. What they needed was an executive outcome. In March 1995, South African PMC executive outcomes arrived in Sierra Leone. For a hefty fee of 1.8 million per month, the contractors promised to retake Sierra Leone's diamond mines, destroy the RUF headquarters, and return the country to government control. And they could do it, because Executive Outcomes was not your average consultancy. When apartheid ended in South Africa, one of the compromises made between the incumbent National Party and the popular ANC was the disbanding of certain Special Forces units. 3-2 Battalion, comprising battle-hardened black and white soldiers from the South African border war, was disbanded, and its members were sent to other units. Following the restructuring of the SADF by the ANC, many experienced soldiers faced bankruptcy. Offering the men lucrative contracts for the same job they'd always done, Executive Outcomes purchased a fully formed and battle-hardened fighting force. They had helicopters, tanks, and armored vehicles from the former Soviet Union and experienced soldiers to crew them. They also recruited military doctors, engineers, and specialists, meaning their force was entirely self-contained. Against a well-trained, well-equipped, and highly experienced force like this, the RUF in Sierra Leone stood no chance. In the first 10 days of fighting, Executive Outcomes pushed the RUF back 60 miles into the interior. 7 months later, they had retaken the diamond mines and destroyed the RUF's main operational base. They were supported by loyalist SLA units and loyalist Camajors. Broken, the RUF signed the Abidjan Peace Accords in Côte d'Ivoire on November 30th, 1996. While Executive Outcomes mopped up, Sierra Leone held free and fair elections. The loyalist Camajors were reorganized into the Civil Defense Forces, or CDFs, and massively expanded. It seemed like the war might be over, but then the UN got involved. The peace accords demanded Executive Outcomes leave within 5 weeks of the arrival of a neutral peacekeeping force. But this wasn't soon enough for the European bureaucrats. As the Sierra Leonean economy was still in shambles, the International Monetary Fund was paying Executive Outcomes' exorbitant monthly rate. Now the job was done, they wanted mercenaries off their books as soon as possible. In January 1997, before the peacekeepers arrived, Executive Outcomes was ordered to leave. Seizing the opportunity, the RUF renewed its fight against government forces, where they got some unexpected help. A faction of SLA officers believed the army was at risk of being eclipsed by the popular and fast-growing CDFs. To remedy this, they freed roughly 600 renegade SLA soldiers from prison in Freetown and proclaimed a new party, the Armed Forces Revolutionary Council, or AFRC, as Sierra Leone's government. The ill-equipped and village-based CDFs couldn't hold Freetown, and it was overrun by the AFRC and RUF, who had joined forces. The city was sacked and the president escaped by helicopter. Mass killings, rape, and looting ensued. The rebels called this Operation No Living Thing and Operation Pay Yourself. It was carnage. The world condemned the violence, but only ECOMOG was willing to step in and actually do anything about it. In 1998, ECOMOG's crack troops, the battle-hardened Nigerians, assaulted Freetown and liberated it from AFRC control. They did this largely without air and armored support, overcoming entrenched positions with not much more than courage and grit. With ECOMOG security present in the city, the president returned. He struck a peace deal with the RUF in July 1999. Called the Lomé Peace Accords, the agreement gave the head of the RUF, Foday Sanko, the vice presidency and control over the diamond mines. In return, the RUF was meant to disarm and stop murdering people. Having finally organized the paperwork, the UN dispatched a force to oversee the disarmament process and monitor the peace. It was named UNAMSIL and effectively replaced the critically under-resourced ECOMOG force. But unlike ECOMOG, who defeated the rebels and took Freetown with just 700 men and no support, the lavishly supplied UNAMSIL worked hard to avoid contact with the enemy. In fact, they were consistently humiliated by enemy forces. In one instance, 500 UNAMSIL peacekeepers were captured by the RUF, who then advanced on Freetown with captured UN weapons and armored vehicles. This incident shook UNAMSIL's confidence and they further avoided the RUF from then on. However, some of the peacekeeper hostages were from India and the Indian army refused to abandon their men. They launched Operation Kukri to break them out. 2 companies of the 5/8 Gorkha Rifles Infantry Battalion were holed up in Kailahun, surrounded by roughly 5,000 RUF fighters, many of whom were armed with captured UN weapons. In July 2003, 2 para-special forces parachuted into Kailahun via British C-130 Hercules and Chinook Helos. the Indian paras destroyed UN supply caches to deny them to the rebels and organized the Gorkha breakout. Taking the RUF by surprise, the Indians smashed through their positions and evacuated every single one of their trapped soldiers. Only one Indian was killed, while the special forces inflicted hundreds of casualties on the RUF. Operation Kukri significantly boosted UNAMSUL morale and demonstrated that swift, decisive action could crush the rebels. The Brits jumped on board too, launching Operation Palliser. Soldiers of the paratroop regiment secured the airport and the RAF began evacuating UNAMSUL staff. British forces also launched small-scale raids and rescue operations across the country, knocking out key RUF leaders and recovering UNAMSUL hostages. The British commander, Brigadier Richards, expanded their mission from rescuing key people to rescuing the whole of UNAMSUL. With the British and Indian Special Forces working together, not to mention a few rough and ready Nigerian units, UNAMSUL was resuscitated. Over the border, the government of Guinea had decided enough was enough and began bombing the crap out of rebel strongholds. The flow of conflict diamonds to Liberia slowed, and with it went the RUF's funding. The RUF was out of money, facing the British and Indian Special Forces, getting clobbered by Nigerian units who were very much done with the whole thing and had bombs falling on their heads daily. With no prospect of escape, the RUF surrendered. Meanwhile, the opportunistic AFRC changed sides again, going back to the loyalist SLA. The RUF were disarmed alongside the CDFs and UNAMSUL monitored the situation. Now that no one had any weapons and everyone had given up on fighting, their job was much easier. On January 18, 2002, the president announced the war was over, but it cast a long shadow. An entire generation of children was denied an education and brutalized by the war. Roughly half of the RUF's strength and a quarter of the government forces consisted of child soldiers, and the mental scars of the conflict still run deep. The RUF's leaders are all now dead or serving life sentences for war crimes. After 11 years of conflict, the fighting stopped and a fragile peace returned to Sierra Leone. To tell this tale, we've got to start at the very beginning with the United States. They got involved in the scramble for Africa just as the Europeans did. They were just late to the party. One of the last regions that hadn't yet been snapped up by the colonial powers was the Pepper Coast, now Liberia. It was here that the American Colonization Society, a strange alliance of emancipist Quakers and racist slave owners, decided to send free Americans with African heritage. The Quakers believed African Americans would have a better chance there, away from racist attitudes. The slaveholders were worried about a rebellion. Both agreed that repatriation was the best course of action, so off to the Pepper Coast went anyone with African heritage who could afford the fee. And that meant any heritage, regardless of where someone might be from. Transposing the example to Europe, imagine a motley crew of Serbs, Swiss and Scots being repatriated to Portugal. Worse than that, the Pepper Coast was already inhabited and the locals had nothing in common with the American newcomers. The newcomers didn't want anything to do with the locals either and married only within their community. This created an Americo-Liberian ethnicity culturally distinct from the region's general population. This group believed itself superior to the locals and instilled a rigid class system. Contemporaries likened Liberia's regime to South Africa's apartheid, albeit based on whether one's ancestors had come from America rather than skin color. While it wasn't always called one, Liberia was a colonial state just like the others that governed most of Africa. Liberia declared independence in 1847, and the Americo-Liberian minority kept tight control of the country until 1980. It was supposed to be a democracy, but the party representing the Americo-Liberians ran Liberia as a one-party state. It was not to last. Citing decades of unfair treatment, economic downturn, and widespread Americo-Liberian corruption, Master Sergeant Samuel Doe, a Liberian native, led 17 soldiers and NCOs in a coup against the regime. They killed the president and seized power, then executed the heads of government. Doe, who promoted himself to general, was the first indigenous leader of Liberia and enjoyed widespread support. He suspended the constitution but promised a return to civilian rule by 1985. Elections were held in October of that year. Doe won, but many argued the elections were fraudulent. A month later, Thomas Kwewonkpa, a military officer of the old regime who had been forced to flee, launched a counter-coup. He had the support of many Gio and Mano people, other indigenous groups that felt sidelined by Doe's preferential treatment of his own group, the Krun. Kwewonkpa's coup was a failure, however, and he was killed, and then reportedly eaten by Doe's security forces. But Kwewonkpa wasn't the only official with a grudge. Charles Taylor had been the Director General of the General Services Agency under Doe, essentially putting him in charge of government purchasing. He was sacked, however, after embezzling $1 million in government funds and escaped to the US when his crime was discovered. But he was caught, arrested on a warrant for extradition, and detained in Plymouth County Correctional Facility, Massachusetts. While awaiting trial, Taylor escaped by sawing through his window bars and abseiling to freedom with a rope made from bedsheets, after which he went dark, resurfacing weeks later as Muammar Gaddafi's protege. During this time, he trained in guerrilla warfare, and once he was ready, he relocated to Côte d'Ivoire. Gathering exiled and disaffected Gio and Mano people into an army named the National Patriot Front of Liberia, or the NPFL, Charles Taylor then invaded Liberia, kicking off Liberia's first civil war in December 1989. Doe was quick to respond, sending 2 battalions of regular armed forces of Liberia, AFL, troops to crush Taylor's insurgency. The soldiers, of whom many were ethnic Kruns, employed scorched earth tactics to deny Taylor's insurgents resources. They did this in regions dominated by Gios and Manos, however, pushing many over to the enemy. The face of the conflict changed. No longer a political campaign, it was now an ethnic war. Thousands were massacred on both sides, and rape was used as a weapon of terror. Across the country, people fled from both the rebels and the soldiers. The rebels captured the strategic town of Banga in May 1990, and 2 months later were fighting in the outskirts of the capital, Monrovia. This was the site of the worst atrocity of the war, when 30 AFL soldiers shot and hacked 600 civilians to death inside St. Peter's Lutheran Church. The only survivors were several children who hid under a mound of corpses. West Africa could not sit idly by while such atrocities were committed. In August 1990, a Nigerian-led contingent of ECOMOG deployed to enforce a ceasefire, evacuate foreigners, and stop the massacre. ECOMOG landed on the beach Normandy style and quickly captured the port despite fierce NPFL defense. The Nigerians, regarded as tough and experienced soldiers, broke the siege on President Doe's palace and forced the rebels to regroup. The NPFL splintered into 2, with Prince Johnson commanding the independent NPFL, or INPFL, forces. 2 weeks later, they intercepted Doe while he was en route to the ECOMOG base for talks. The president's torture and execution were videotaped and broadcast for all to see. The AFL broke, and many of Doe's loyalists fled across the border into Guinea and Sierra Leone. While they licked their wounds, ECOMOG tried for peace. 6 peace conferences were held, but Taylor, the principal instigator of the violence, refused to attend until they made him president. Instead, they elected Dr. Amos Sawyer, an academic, as president. Unsurprisingly, the NPFL and INPFL refused to accept him and continued fighting. Sawyer controlled Monrovia but relied on ECOMOG to hold it. Chaos ruled the rest of Liberia. While ECOMOG pursued peace, a new faction appeared. The United Liberation Movement of Liberia for Democracy, or ULIMO, coalesced from remnants of the AFL and Doe's loyalists. Its members briefly fought alongside government forces in Sierra Leone, then, in September 1991, attacked the NPFL, conquering swaths of territory. ULIMO divided its spoils but also divided itself in the process. It broke into 2 factions organized on ethnic lines: Roosevelt Johnson's Kran ULIMO J and Alaji Kroma's Mandingo ULIMO K. It was these factions that sponsored some of the most deranged and brutal warlords of the entire conflict. First among these sadistic killers was General Butt Naked. Joshua Blahi was initiated as a Kran high priest at the tender age of 11. By 14, he was performing black magic rituals for dough at the presidential palace to help him win the upcoming election. At 21, Blahi was a full-blown zealot convinced an ancient spirit had called him to war. His beliefs rubbed off on those around him, and Blahi soon commanded a fanatical Ulamo J force comprised mostly of child soldiers. They believed in the power of his magic, and Blahi concocted rituals involving copious amounts of drugs to convince them they were bulletproof. He and his flock then tore off their clothes and charged into battle, killing everything in their path. Stories of this naked lunatic circulated wildly, and he became known as General Butt Naked, and his disciples the Naked Base Commandos. Fear was their primary weapon, and their depravity knew no bounds. Once the Naked Base Commandos had captured an area, General Butt Naked would take more drugs to give himself a vision. The spirit would then tell him who to sacrifice. It was usually a child. In General Butt Naked's own words, "They bring to me a living child that I slaughter and take the heart out to eat." What's more shocking is he wasn't the only one doing this. Aliou Kosaya, a Ulamo warlord known as Bluff Boy, also murdered and ate people, as did Mohammed Jabate, otherwise known as Jungle Jabba. Acts of cannibalism usually involved the victim's heart and were used as part of rituals to gain strength and terrify foes. At this point, the UN decided to get involved. In September 1993, they sent in 368 military observers as part of UNAMIL. These soldiers deployed alongside ECOMOG, but left the West Africans to do the lion's share of fighting. The situation worsened in 1994, and some UNAMIL personnel were captured and held for ransom by the rebels. The war had also kick-started a humanitarian crisis. 1.8 million people were displaced and in desperate need of food, shelter, and above all, safety. In light of the constant factional fighting and warlord rule over most of the country, the UN acknowledged it wasn't up to the task. Into the gap stepped the Ghanaian president, Jerry Rawlings. Rawlings was a regional power player, and his extensive connections brought Taylor and the other warlords to the negotiating table. In August 1995, Taylor's MPFL and the Ulamo factions agreed to a ceasefire. An interim civilian government held power while the country was readied for elections, but before they took place, fighting broke out again. In April 1996, NPFL attacked Monrovia. The two ethnic wings of Ulamo fought back, and both sides battled against minor warlords, gang bosses, and third-party factions. ECOMOG marched in, and the uncompromising Nigerians lived up to their take-no-prisoners reputation. Law and order was re-established within a month, but roughly half the city was destroyed and most of its population displaced. All foreigners were pulled out by UN security forces during the fighting. They looked after their own. With Monrovia now secured by ECOMOG troops, another peace conference was held. The Second Abuja Conference marked the 15th and final attempt at brokering a peace deal between the factions. It included a full disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration package for fighters from all sides, and gave power to another civilian transitionary government named the Ruling Council. Things were relatively calm until July 1997, when elections were held. Charles Taylor led the National Patriotic Party and ran on an intimidation platform. His cooperation was critical to maintain the fragile peace, so if he pulled out, people knew the fighting and terror would resume. His slogan was probably the most on the nose in modern political history. His supporters chanted, "He killed my ma, he killed my pa, but I will vote for him." Shockingly, people did. Taylor won the election in a landslide, taking 75% of the vote. The UN managed the election and upheld its results, even though it was the last thing they wanted. With Taylor's victory, unsteady peace returned to Liberia. However, violence continued to flare up in regional areas and along Liberia's borders. Taylor's political rivals were eliminated, and the state industries turned over to producing goods to exchange for weapons and drugs. Taylor funneled these to gather rebel groups in West Africa and made himself incredibly rich in the process. For ECOMOG and the UN, the First Liberian Civil War could not have had a worse outcome. Due to a lack of records, it's impossible to say how many were killed during the conflict in Liberia. But our best guess is that between 80,000 and 200,000 people were killed, between 1989 and 1997. Nearly 2 million were displaced, and virtually all of Liberia's wealth was looted and its state infrastructure destroyed. Charles Taylor, a convicted fraudster, escaped justice in Liberia in 1984, only to resurface in neighbouring Cote d'Ivoire 5 years later. With support from Libya's revolutionary leader, Colonel Gaddafi, Taylor raised an army and invaded Liberia. Marginalised people of the Crane Group joined his cause, going head-to-head with government forces. Atrocities and war crimes were committed by all sides, and the major forces rapidly broke into several competing factions. West African forces known as ECOMOG and the UN got involved, but neither could stop the widespread violence and looting as Liberia was slowly torn apart. Peace conferences were held abroad, and it quickly became clear that Taylor's support was the key to stopping the violence. He played on this, gaining more and more concessions from the peacekeepers until, in 1996, the fighting stopped. He ran for the presidency in the UN-monitored 1997 general election and won. After taking office, Taylor's first policies emptied the national army of roughly 2,500 of his former enemies. He then replaced them with men loyal to him personally. Taylor saw himself as a political strongman destined to forge Greater Liberia. His state was an autocracy founded on coercion and funded by blood diamonds. Violence pervaded every administrative level. To survive in a state like this, a man needed a strong army, and no one's army was stronger than Taylor's. But he wasn't the only one who realized this. Roosevelt Johnson, whom you may remember as the head of Ulimo J, managed to survive the post-war purges and gather strength. This scared Taylor, so he lashed out. In September 1998, he trumped a charge of treason and then ordered an attack on Johnson's safehouse. A fierce gun battle ensued, with the die-hard men of Ulimo J making a last stand to buy Johnson time to escape. They were nearly all killed, but their sacrifice held the police back long enough for Johnson to get to the US Embassy. In the chaos, swaths of Monrovia were destroyed. The message to Liberia, however, was clear. No one messes with Charles Taylor. Rebels massed on Liberia's Guinean border. The Civil War and Taylor's repression had forced many to flee, and now they were back with a vengeance. This group called itself Liberians United for Reconciliation and Democracy, or LURD, and was sponsored by the Guinean government. Guinea was concerned about Taylor's sponsorship of the Revolutionary United Front in Sierra Leone. By 1999, two countries on their border had already been torn apart, largely because of Taylor, and Guinea did not want to become the third. Before they invaded, LURD allied itself with Sierra Leonean Camajors, a faction of the ongoing Sierra Leone civil war that was both an organized criminal gang and a patriot militia. They crossed the border in the north, and Taylor sent out his best men to meet them. His best was the Anti-Terrorism Unit, or ATU. They were his enforcers. Incorporating the toughest and most brutal fighters from his old faction, the NPFL, and trained by South African mercenaries, the ATU left terror and corpses wherever it went. They were used like a Soviet blocking detachment to ensure Taylor's undisciplined irregular forces stayed in the fight. For the irregulars, facing the enemy was a whole lot less terrifying than the ATU. By 2001, LURD pushed Taylor's forces back, and despite counterattacks from the RUF in Sierra Leone, was still gaining ground. Taylor responded by jacking up the RUF's funding, which had the unintended consequence of angering the British, who had just intervened in Sierra Leone and were trying to establish peace. What had begun as a fight between pro- and anti-Taylor forces was now a complicated four-way war between 1. Britain, Guinea and half of Sierra Leone against 2. Liberia and the RUF, who were 3. Also battling a host of other Liberian and Guinean rebel groups, as well as 4. ECOMOG and the UN. As they approached Liberia's capital, Monrovia, LURD met increasingly well-organized resistance. This caused them to break off their direct assault. They chose to launch raids and hit-and-run attacks instead. These were extremely successful, and it wasn't long before LURD controlled large parts of Liberia, including the strategic center, Bongtown, the capital of Bong County. Panic whipped through Monrovia. memories of the widespread destruction, cannibalism, and chaos of the last war were still fresh in people's minds. To maintain control, Taylor declared martial law. The rebels held back this time, choosing not to attack. This choice likely saved the lives of thousands of civilians. But far from Monrovia, in Liberia's south, wheels were turning. Another rebel group had arisen and was making rapid territorial gains against Taylor's loyalists. They were the Movement for Democracy in Liberia, or MODEL, and were backed by Côte d'Ivoire's government. MODEL's fighters were recruited from Liberian refugee camps from those who were sick of constant raids and unending violence. By early 2003, they had captured large areas in Liberia's south and were pushing toward Monrovia. Combined with LURD's gains from the north, Taylor now controlled only 30% of his own country, but things were about to get even worse for him. A redeployment of fighters to battle Model in the south critically weakened Taylor's forces in the north, and LURD broke through. Taylor's men were unable to continue a war on two fronts and subsequently pulled back to the capital. LURD reached the outskirts of Monrovia in June 2003 and began a devastating 2-month siege. To rebuff them, Taylor pulled out all the stops. Child soldiers were conscripted inside the city en masse and weapons were handed out with zero training. Mortar fire was so poorly aimed that it seemed to demolish buildings at random, contributing in no small part to the staggering number of civilian casualties. On the ground, people called the siege World War III, which was apt as it probably resembled the final days of the Battle of Berlin. Taylor had no way out. More of his city was destroyed every day and the forces of his enemies encroached ever closer. Child soldiers hopped up on cocaine weren't a match for rebels with years of combat experience and modern equipment. The rotten house he had built for himself was finally crumbling around him. Perhaps the devout Christian in Taylor considered the words of Matthew, "For all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword." LURD called a ceasefire in late July, and in August, Taylor officially resigned the presidency. While he flew into exile in Nigeria, crowds of civilians across Monrovia burst spontaneously into song and dance. They could not have been happier to see the end of his reign. ECOMOG forces and a small number of US Marines secured Monrovia while the UN organized an intervention to return Liberia to a functioning democracy. The United Nations mission in Liberia, UNMIL, deployed in September 2003 to monitor the fragile peace and disarm the rebel factions still at large in the countryside. Aid poured into the country from NGOs and the international community, but Liberia still has a long way to go. Over the border in Sierra Leone, the RUF was crippled by the loss of Taylor's support and by constant attacks from Britain, India, Guinea, Nigeria, and internal pro-government forces. One of Taylor's key men, Sam Bokkary, otherwise known as General Mosquito, lost a battle with his nemesis, General Mosquito Spray, and fled into Liberia. Just 2 months before his regime collapsed, Taylor suspected Mosquito of treachery and had him killed. General Butt Naked, the cannibal warlord that killed over 20,000 people in service to an ancient spirit that spoke to him when he was high, became a born-again Christian. After ingesting a copious amount of drugs, the commander hallucinated his own intervention, where Jesus told him to stop being a slave. Joshua Blyhe, as he is now known, is an evangelical preacher who continues to raise money and support for victims of war in West Africa, particularly child soldiers. He received amnesty for his crimes. Charles Taylor, on the other hand, didn't repent. He was charged with 11 counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity at the UN Special Council on Sierra Leone. He pleaded not guilty but was convicted on all 11 counts after a lengthy court process that finally concluded in April 2012. During the trial, it came out that Taylor had forced many to commit acts of cannibalism against their will, facilitated mass rapes, and celebrated military victories with human sacrifices. He denied everything and stated Jesus Christ was accused of being a murderer in his time. Taylor remains locked up in HM Prison Frankland in County Durham, England. He is due to be released in 2052, by which time he'll be 104 years old. Africa has 3 Guineas. One used to be French and is now called Guinea, another used to be Spanish and is now called Equatorial Guinea, and the third, the subject of this video, was ruled by Portugal. It's now called Guinea-Bissau. Guinea-Bissau has a 500-year history of Portuguese domination, and by the 1950s, it was a backwater. The reclusive dictator António de Oliveira Salazar ran Portugal, and his administration wasn't all that interested in the old colonial empire. Investment in Guinea-Bissau was minimal, and the country's governor didn't even know how many people he governed. Infrastructure was neglected and roads were unpaved, meaning schools and clinics were inaccessible for most. In 1950, 99% of the population was illiterate. Epidemics, particularly sleeping sickness, often swept the nation, killing thousands. Small-scale resistance movements had popped up throughout Guinea-Bissau's colonial history, but none had been particularly successful. One man believed he could change that: Amilcar Cabral. An agronomist by training, Cabral became an activist while studying in Lisbon. He strongly opposed Portugal's dictatorship and promoted the independence of Portugal's overseas territories. Upon his return home, he founded the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde, shortened to PAIGC, alongside fellow activist Rafael Barbosa. Their activities started peacefully, with demonstrations, but it wasn't long before things turned violent. On August 3, 1959, dock workers in Bissau's port went on strike. Extremely low wages left them unable to provide for their families, and the Portuguese company that owned the docks refused to negotiate. The police were called and they arrived ready for a fight. When the men refused to work, the police hurled several grenades and opened fire. The strikers scattered, with many jumping into the water to escape. They were shot as they tried to swim away. Between 25 and 50 workers died on scene, while many more were seriously wounded. The incident, which became known as the Pijigiti Massacre, demonstrated to the whole of Guinea-Bissau that the Portuguese tolerated no dissent and were willing to shoot unarmed people to maintain control. Cabral knew about the strike as it was being planned and lent it PAIGC's support, but wasn't directly involved. This didn't matter to the police. They blamed the bloodshed on PAIGC anyway. Cabral and his activists felt they had just one option left. If the Portuguese were committed to violence, then so were they. PAIGC relocated its headquarters to Conakry, the capital of neighbouring Guinea, in 1960. Here, Cabral gathered strength and readied his forces. A pact was made between PAIGC and forces fighting for the independence of Angola, Mozambique, and the island nation of São Tomé and Príncipe. All were Portuguese colonies, like Guinea-Bissau, and all were committed to fighting the Portuguese for independence. Together, they established the Conference of Nationalist Organizations of the Portuguese Colonies, CONCP, to champion their interests to the rest of the world. Cabral also declared the PAIGC to be Marxist, winning them considerable support from the communist bloc. The war started in January 1963 when PAIGC guerrillas attacked a Portuguese garrison at Tite. Other towns in southern Guinea-Bissau with Portuguese military presences were attacked soon after. The colonials tried to hit back, but it was a nightmare. Guinea-Bissau's geography was ideal for guerrilla warfare. Thick jungle, deep rivers, and a dispersed population made it very easy for PAIGC fighters to slip away before the Portuguese could bring heavier weapons to bear. This was one area where they possessed a decisive advantage, as, at this stage, most PAIGC platoons had no more than one pre-World War II rifle or SMG and a handful of pistols to go around. If PAIGC fighters were masters of the jungle, the Portuguese were masters of the air. Their response to PAIGC raids was bombing campaigns against villages thought to be harboring the enemy. Hundreds of settlements were destroyed, often on no more evidence than a vague suspicion. 500,000 people were displaced and fled across the border into Guinea. Those who wanted revenge were only too welcome in the ranks of the PAIGC. Attacks ramped up at the end of 1963, with Cabral even declaring the islands around Como free from colonial control. This finally caught the attention of the government in Lisbon, which, until this point, hadn't taken the independence movement in Guinea-Bissau seriously. Salazar approved a troop surge, and before long, 35,000 Portuguese troops were in country. They launched Operation Tridente in January 1964 with the goal of annihilating the rebels in Guinea-Bissau's southern coastal region around modern-day Catió. It was believed that Cabral had a major base in the area, so the Portuguese went all in trying to destroy it. Marines landed on the beach and secured strategic points. All farm produce in the area was burned, livestock were shot, and villages were bombed to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. A few isolated skirmishes were fought, and the rebels managed to shoot down a T-6 Texan fighter plane with rifle fire, but otherwise, things were quiet. Many Portuguese found the environment unbearable and just wanted to smash the rebels and move on. They were trying to fight a conventional war against an unconventional enemy. By April 1964, Portuguese forces had withdrawn from Como. It was soon back under PAIGC control, and Cabral's forces helped the villagers replace their lost livestock. Though technically a Portuguese victory, Operation Tridente became a propaganda coup for Cabral. Armed with stories of burning villages and starving people, Cabral asked the international community for help. Cuba was quick to support him and sent several army medical units as well as other specialists to fill capability gaps. The Soviet Union also took pity on the neglected nation, choosing to send crates of Kalashnikovs and RPGs. In 1965, 75 Bissau Guineans were enrolled in a guerrilla warfare training course in Soviet Ukraine, while a cadre of women were trained as nurses elsewhere in the USSR. Generous supplies of ammunition and additional weapons were sent with warm regards from the People's Republic of China. A great deal of the logistics behind this international support was organized by the Guinean government. They were ideologically aligned with Cabral's cause and, at the expense of their own security, committed to helping the movement however they could. With weapons and official support from the communist bloc, the PAIGC's ranks swelled. This put pressure on their food supplies, however, as Cabral was especially keen to avoid taking too much from locals. His solution was agronomy. He trained a detachment of farmers in agronomy and sent them out alongside the guerrillas. When they moved into a new village, Cabral's men would teach the locals new farming techniques and give them modern tools, thereby increasing agricultural output. It didn't matter then that the guerrillas had to take more from the locals, because now the locals had much more to give. This was part of a broader Hearts and Minds campaign to win Bissau Guineans over to PAIGC's cause. Alongside the brutal suppression of other independence groups, such as the Struggle Front for the National Independence of Guinea, whose members were murdered when they refused to switch allegiance to the PAIGC, the campaign worked. By the mid-1960s, PAIGC was the most powerful independent force in Guinea-Bissau. Growing international support for the rebels legitimized the conflict and worried Lisbon. By 1968, losing Guinea-Bissau to a hostile government had become a real possibility. To remedy the situation, they deployed General Antonio de Espinola and began a new campaign. Instead of burning villages and shooting cattle, Portugal would try to win the locals over by being nice. General Espinola started by building roads, schools, and clinics in outlying areas. He also overhauled the colonial administration to make it much less discriminatory toward local Bissau Guineans and kick-started a massive recruiting drive. Africans were welcomed into the colonial military and some even became officers, something previously unheard of. Their flagship unit was the African Commandos, a cool-sounding force led exclusively by black officers. It was believed by the Portuguese that these men would make better jungle fighters, and they might have done, but they couldn't hold the flame to the highly experienced and battle-hardened fighters of the PAIGC. The rebels thought of the African colonial soldiers as cannon fodder. The last of General Espinola's changes was the Portuguese plan of attack. Targeted raids against rebel supply bases replaced grand maneuvers, and intelligence agents began collecting data on PAIGC's leaders. As the founder of the movement, Cabral was an obvious target, but he was also increasingly in the international spotlight. He closed a deal with Sweden for medical aid in 1969, and Sweden quickly became PAIGC's most important non-military backer. They were particularly impressed with Cabral's competence in leading the liberation struggle, but this posed a threat to the Portuguese. They went after him in November 1970 as part of Operation Sea Green. 420 colonial marines stormed ashore into the Guinean capital of Conakry. Their objective was to destroy PAIGC landing ships, rescue POWs, overthrow Guinea's government, and neutralize Cabral. The first two objectives were achieved swiftly, but overthrowing the government proved to be a bigger job than they'd planned for. Most of Guinea's officials managed to escape, and Cabral was actually away in Europe during the operation. Nevertheless, the Portuguese chalked it up as a win and withdrew. Maybe they knew what was coming. Cabral was assassinated by revolutionary rival Inocêncio Cani and another PAIGC member on January 20th, 1973. It's still not clear if Lisbon was involved, but it's a little too convenient for them not to have been. In response, PAIGC's allies stepped up their efforts. The Soviets began supplying the rebels with brand new Strela 2 shoulder-mounted heat-seeking missiles. These were a game changer. By 1973, guerrilla activity kept the Portuguese restricted to major towns and fortified bases, but their air power still posed a significant threat. Now, however, the rebels could shoot down aircraft without exposing themselves, effectively grounding the Portuguese colonial air force. With their air power grounded, the Portuguese were besieged within their bases. In September, the PAIGC declared Guinea-Bissau's independence, and it was generally recognized internationally. Lisbon vowed to fight on, but Salazar's regime was toppled in the Carnation Revolution before he could follow through on the threat. Portugal's new regime granted Guinea-Bissau its full independence on September 24, 1974, ending the 11-and-a-half-year war. Following the Second World War, European nations started decolonizing Africa. Not because they'd finally seen the error of their ways, but because they were so riddled with debt they could no longer afford to maintain their colonies. Throughout the 1950s until 1975, many independence treaties were negotiated, and the African continent went through major political change. As with most great power shifts throughout history, the decolonization of Africa was rife with violence. Rebellions, coups, and civil wars plagued the continent, and a number of dictators forced their way into power. One such dictator was the now infamous, and now dead, Muammar Gaddafi of Libya. Gaddafi seized power in 1969 following a coup d'etat. Like many dictators, Gaddafi was an ultra-nationalist who wanted his country to be as self-sufficient as possible. He wanted to take back everything, land, resource or otherwise, that he felt had been stolen from Libya. A long chunk of land in northern Chad called the Al-Zawr Strip was among the things Gaddafi wanted to reclaim. In 1935, France controlled Chad and Italy controlled Libya. The two European nations entered an agreement in which France would give the Al-Zawr Strip to Italy as part of a post-World War I award. Though the leaders in France and Italy signed the treaty, it was never ratified and the Al-Zawr Strip remained part of Chad. Gaddafi felt that the Al-Zawr Strip was Libya's rightful property. Therefore, in 1972, he began an intervention in Chad. At this time, the country was in the midst of a bitter civil war, and Libya was supplying Chadian rebels with weapons to secure allegiances with them. Giving so much military power to the rebels made Chad's authoritarian leader, Francois Tombalbaye, nervous, which opened the door for Gaddafi to enter negotiations with Tombalbaye. These negotiations ended with Gaddafi occupying the Al-Zawr Strip, but promising that he'd stop sending supplies to the Chadian rebels. The Al-Zawr Strip wasn't anything special, mostly desert and sparsely populated. However, it was rumored to have uranium deposits, which Gaddafi wanted very badly. And more than anything, the occupation of the Al-Zawr Strip was a way for Gaddafi to puff his chest and show off Libya's increasing wealth and power within North Africa. Libya owned the Strip fair and square for 3 years after the occupation. That changed when Francois Tombalbaye was overthrown in 1975. The Chadian military didn't like Gaddafi's influence in their country, which reopened hostilities between the two nations. So, once again, Gaddafi began supplying weapons to the northern rebels. There were a series of military interventions by Libya in the late 70s and early 80s, with France lending Chad a hand during some of them. In 1983, a line was drawn across the country with the pro-government forces in southern Chad and rebel groups in the north. Because Gaddafi had aligned himself with the Chadian rebels and had been supplying them with AK-47s, RPGs, mortars, and recoilless cannons, he indirectly controlled half of Chad. Military bases he'd constructed in the Al Strip further consolidated his influence. The conflict raged on throughout most of the 1980s. In support of 5,000 Chadian rebels, Gaddafi brought 7,000 troops, 60 combat aircraft, 300 tanks, and a number of Mi-24 helicopters and artillery pieces to bear. This compares to just 5,000 poorly armed troops in the south. Even with French support, the forces of southern Chad were no match. Libya's equipment was far from state-of-the-art, but they far outclassed the Chadians. What the Libyans lacked, however, was organization. Gaddafi's troops hadn't been trained to act as assault infantry, to do reconnaissance, or to do anything except give the Chadian rebels weapons and an extra hand here and there. After some success early in the conflict, like taking the capital city in 1981 alongside the rebels, the Libyans got somewhat complacent and began losing motivation. So in 1986, when the Chadian rebels turned on Gaddafi following a number of defeats, the Libyans were screwed. On the other hand, the southern troops welcomed defected rebels with open arms, doubling their numbers. While the northern rebels had far more advanced military knowledge, having been trained by East German officers, the southern forces had a secret weapon. The French had provided the southern Chadian forces with 400 brand new Toyota pickup trucks, mostly Hiluxes and some Land Cruisers. But why these cars? Toyota created Hilux in 1968 to compete with American-made pickup trucks. The aim was to create a comfortable and extremely durable vehicle that would outperform its competitors. Today, the Hilux is so well known for being durable, it has earned the nickname the Nokia of trucks. To prove that point, the BBC's popular show Top Gear put the Hilux's robustness to the test. The host submerged one of these vehicles in the sea, dropped a caravan on it, smashed it with a wrecking ball, set it on fire, and then put it on top of a skyscraper, which they then demolished with explosives. And the Hilux still started. Hiluxes were also great because soldiers didn't need special training to drive them, and any halfway decent mechanic could repair one no matter how banged up it got. They were a major asset to the Chadian forces, and the vehicle's unassuming nature played a major role in Chad's ultimate victory. As we said before, Gaddafi and the Libyans were up a creek without a paddle after their rebel allies ditched them. The dictator's forces were scattered. They had no knowledge of the area and no clear plan for success. Morale was low, and most soldiers were confused as to why they were there at all. Still, Gaddafi pursued conflict under the impression that superior equipment would be enough to secure victory. The Chadians, however, were much more of a threat than Gaddafi gave them credit for. They used their enemy's disorganization to buy time and lay out a winning plan. The soldiers were highly motivated, knew the land, and knew their enemy. And they had Toyotas. They fitted the trucks with artillery, machine guns, and anti-aircraft guns gifted to them by France and the US. With the French providing air cover, they launched their counter-offensive on January 2nd, 1987, catching the Libyans completely off guard. The Chadians first attacked the Libyan-held city of Fada, almost annihilating the Libyan armored brigade. The Libyans were shocked that their tanks were no match for the Toyotas, which ran circles around the slow-moving armored vehicles and fired at them with ease. The Chadians took out 100 tanks in that first battle alone, while the Libyans destroyed just 3 Toyotas. In March of that same year, the Chadians quickly captured the Wadi Doum airbase, which had been defended by 5,000 Libyan soldiers, as well as armored vehicles, tanks, aircraft, and fields of landmines. With Libyan aircraft grounded because of the French, and with Toyotas ruining Libyan tanks with their anti-tank guns, all the Chadians had to worry about were the landmines. Luckily for them, they found paths through the minefields, which meant they could drive right up to the airstrip virtually unopposed. There's even an unverified account that if the Chadians drove over the mines at speeds of 100 km per hour, they didn't trigger the mines at all. Within the first few months of the Chadian counterattack, an estimated 3,000 Libyan soldiers had either been captured or killed, or they'd deserted. Chadian forces had all but recaptured the country, with one notable exception: the Al Strip. So why stop now? The French, however, would not press on, concerned an attack on the Strip would lead to an international conflict. The Chadians, would have to continue without air support. While they captured the town of Alzar with relative ease, they soon learned that it was much harder to defend with Toyotas than it was to attack with them, especially now that the Libyans could attack them from the air. The Chadians were driven out of the Alzar Strip just 20 days after they captured it. But that defeat did not break their spirits. They regrouped and came up with a new plan. They would drive 200 kilometers into Libya and attack Ma'aten al-Sada airbase. Not only were they successful in this attack, but they also made it to the airbase completely undetected. It was a slaughter. In one night, the Libyans lost between 1,000 and 1,700 soldiers, 70 tanks, at least 30 APCs, and between 26 and 32 aircraft. By comparison, the Chadians lost 65 men and a handful of Toyotas. The attack on the airbase scared the French as they weren't sure if the Chadians would continue their offensive in Libya. If they did, and the conflict escalated further, the French could have been implicated by the Libyans in the invasion of their country. Even though the French removed themselves from the conflict before the Chadians got to the Alzar Strip, they played a major role in helping the Chadians get there in the first place. So, a few days after the attack in September 1987, the French called for a ceasefire, hoping to save themselves from being pulled into a war they didn't want to fight in. Luckily for them, the two fighting nations agreed to the ceasefire. Many feared that fighting between Chad and Libya would start again, but the ceasefire violations that did occur were minor. By October the following year, Chad and Libya resumed diplomatic relations. In September 1990, the two countries agreed to hand the matter of the Alzar Strip over to the International Court of Justice. 4 years later, the court ruled in favor of Chad. The Alzar Strip was returned to the Chadians and the matter was laid to rest. As for the Toyotas, the Chadians had started a global trend. The trucks are now ubiquitous in conflicts in Africa and the Middle East. The Toyota Hilux and Land Cruiser are the preferred vehicles of rebel groups all over the world, and Australians. Between Nigeria in the east and Senegal in the northwest, 8 nations occupy the West African coastline. The largest of these nations is Ivory Coast, or Côte d'Ivoire. As a crossroads of transatlantic trade across the sea and trans-Saharan trade across the desert, Ivory Coast has been central to the economic and political landscape of this part of the world for centuries. Sometimes, this position has bestowed great blessings upon the land and its people. Gold, ideas, and commodities have all flowed freely across what is now Ivory Coast. At other times, it's brought curses, not least the slave trade and colonial interest from the nations of Western Europe. While this position on the coast of West Africa has shaped centuries of Ivorian history, it's the influence and ideas of just a handful of men that have guided the nation's course in the last few decades. This is the story of how a desire for power and control once again spilled over into bloodshed and turmoil, and how ideas like national identity and cultural supremacy quite literally tore a nation in two. The trans-Saharan trade networks that flourished in the late medieval and early modern periods brought prosperity to the lands now known as Ivory Coast or Côte d'Ivoire. While the Guinean and Malayan empires were the dominant forces in the region, independent kingdoms flourished in these parts of West Africa, and the Malinke people brought with them the new faith and philosophy of Islam from the north and west. When the Great Malian Empire collapsed in the 16th century, the region destabilized, and new kingdoms sprung up in these lands. Buna was one, as was Kong. The Abron kingdom of Gyaman and the Bolek kingdom would follow. The growing Asante Empire brought conquest and imperial control to this part of West Africa in the 18th century, but it would be colonialism of a different kind that rocked these shores in the following century. At first, the Portuguese and the French stuck to the coastlines, but France would have absorbed all of what is now Ivory Coast into its empire by the end of the 19th century. It was the vast resource wealth that drove the French further inland, and their exploitative tactics enriched the empire at the expense of local communities. To harvest these resources, the French instituted a policy of forced labor. When this wasn't enough, they began to import laborers from nearby Upper Volta, modern-day Burkina Faso. These heavy-handed approaches, with little regard for the human cost, would lay the groundwork for the tensions and rifts that would strike the country post-independence. Ivorians fought and died alongside the French in the First World War, the forced conscription leading to significant revolts that would not be fully quelled until 1918. Yet, significant French investment began to transform the lands in the years that followed. Remaining under the control of Vichy France as the Second World War broke out, the experience of indigenous Ivorians during the 1940s was a wretched one, and this hardship led to a real push for independence in the post-war years. As World War II ended, Félix Houphouët-Boigny emerged as a political leader in the developing colony, founding the African Farmers Union, or the SAA, in 1944 and going on to serve in the French Assembly in 1946, where he promoted a law banning forced labor in the colonies. It would not be until 1960 that independence was granted. Houphouët-Boigny, a former minister in the French Parliament, began the first of his 7 terms in office as president of the fledgling nation. It would be Houphouët-Boigny's death in 1993 that catalyzed the series of events that plunged Ivory Coast into turmoil once again. The 1980s brought an economic storm to the Ivory Coast. The nation relied on revenue from its key exports of coffee and cocoa, but a slump in global commodity prices made it difficult for Ivorian businesses to compete on the world stage. Drought racked the country further, while the Ivory Coast's citizens struggled with mounting personal debt. Fluctuations in the commodity market brought a series of booms and busts, and a divestment program proved disastrous, siphoning much-needed funds out of the Ivory Coast. There was also political and ethnic tensions. The idea of Ivoirité, essentially the true nature and characteristics of a genuine Ivorian, was a major issue in the country. To begin with, Ivoirité was something similar to the American dream, a general philosophy of what it means to be Ivorian that all could engage with, no matter where they'd come from. As time passed, however, the term became a rallying point for nationalistic and xenophobic elements in Ivorian society, and it was used to exclude the immigrants and foreign-born individuals who made up 1/3 of the country's population. The death of President Houphouët-Boigny in 1993 plunged the Ivory Coast into further political turmoil. While the economy did rally in the mid-90s, recovery was torpedoed by a military coup in 1999, which ousted Houphouët-Boigny's successor, Henrique Nambidi. There was little optimism in Ivory Coast at the dawn of the new millennium. Former military commander Robert Gué held on to power following the coup and refused to relinquish this power even after presidential elections in 2000. While Laurent Gbagbo won this election, Gué's security forces would kill hundreds and injure thousands before a transition could take place. Ivorians were now looking at the very real prospects of a civil war. This civil war would begin less than 2 years later with another military rebellion in September 2002. Rebel forces struck 3 Ivorian cities on September 19th, including the largest metropolis, Abidjan. Chaos reigned. At some point in those opening hours, Gué was shot dead, while forces in support of the rebel Guillaume Soro and his patriotic movement of Côte d'Ivoire, or MPCI, failed to take their key objective of Abidjan. Gbagbo began an immediate crackdown on the rebels, even destroying the homes of thousands of immigrants accused of supporting the insurrection. The long-threatened civil war was now underway. Abidjan was still in government hands, but on their retreat back to the north, the MPCI succeeded in taking over vast swaths of Ivorian territory, including the cities of Bouaké and Korogo. Ivory Coast was essentially split in two. 3 days later, on September 22nd, France launched Operation Leone, a protective and peacekeeping measure according to the French government, and certainly not an intervention. French involvement would prove to be a critical factor over the coming years, as government and rebel sides sought sometimes to exploit the French presence and at other times to outmaneuver it. Later, there would be direct clashes between French and Ivorian troops. But first, there would be attempts at peace. Several attempts, in fact. Between October and December, there was a partial ceasefire as representatives of a number of West African states sought to broker an end to the conflict. The talks went nowhere, and by the end of the year, 2 more rebel groups had entered the fray: the Movement for Justice and Peace, or MJP, and the Ivorian Popular Movement of the Great West, the MPIGO. The murder of Robert Gay, allegedly orchestrated by the government at their first opportunity, was a major sticking point. Further talks throughout the first half of 2003 culminated in mass protests against the so-called French occupation, and eventually a UN peacekeeping mission in May. On July 4th, 2003, government and rebel forces announced an end to the conflict. According to the Linas Makosi Accord, laid down back in January, the opposing sides would implement a power-sharing deal through a government of national reconciliation. And yet, violence continued throughout the summer. In August, the French forces suffered their first casualties as 2 soldiers were killed. Back in the French capital, 10 people were arrested in Paris after an apparent plot to assassinate Gbagbo. The First Ivorian Civil War was supposedly over, but political turmoil and even out-and-out violence were still very much part of the reality of the Ivory Coast. It was early November 2004 when the fractious ceasefire finally broke down. Ivory Coast was still largely divided between the government-held and nominally Christian/animist South and the rebel-held primarily Muslim North, while the MCPI, the MPIGO, and MJP had largely coalesced into the new forces of the Ivory Coast, or FNCI, back in December of 2002. On November 4th, Gbagbo ordered a counter-offensive of the rebel town of Bouaké. The operation would be backed, Gbagbo ordered, by airstrikes. 2 days later, government Sukhoi Su-25 bombers took to the skies over Bouaké. Crewed by Ivorian pilots, along with mercenaries from Belarus, the Su-25s fired upon a rebel position. What happened next is unclear, but at least one of the Su-25s unleashed its payload upon French peacekeeping forces in the town, killing 9 soldiers as well as an American civilian conducting scientific research in the area. French President Jacques Chirac was outraged, claiming an intentional assault on his forces, while Gbagbo claimed the strike had been accidental. The French response was immediate. When the Su-25s landed at Abidjan an hour later, they were assaulted by the French 2nd Marine Infantry Regiment, who were then themselves assaulted by a helicopter gunship. Violence began to break out across the city. Civilians took to the streets in protest, marching on the airport and on a French military base. Government troops and French forces engaged in a firefight, while rocket-propelled grenades struck a French transport aircraft. French troops also set about destroying government planes and helicopters around the airport as the protesters broke through into the terminal buildings. Over the coming days, thousands of protesters assaulted French targets around Abidjan. France stepped up its evacuations of French citizens in the country and used helicopters, armored cars, and gunboats to subdue the unrest. At least 20, and some records say 60, Ivorian civilians were killed as French troops opened fire on protesters, and other deaths of both military personnel and civilians were reported across Abidjan. The situation calmed after November 7th, and an arms embargo on Ivory Coast was initiated a week later. However, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, whose citizens had been directly involved in the airstrikes, helped Gbagbo and his government rebuild their air force in the months following the action. Operation Leone, or Unicorn, did not begin with the 2004 clashes, nor did it end there. For 13 years, French forces remained active in Ivory Coast, conducting peacekeeping missions, maintaining the security of French civilians and businesses, and, occasionally, getting involved in the fighting themselves. The Leone operation was carried out by battalion task groups, known as GTIAs, operating alongside the UNOSI, the United Nations' own peacekeeping force. Until 2008, there were 3 of these GTIAs, but a shift in policy after this point saw a restructuring of military activities in Ivory Coast. Some accuse the French government of exceeding their remit in Ivory Coast. After the Ivorian-French clashes in 2004, the country's National Assembly President Mamadou Coulibaly told Ivorian state television that Ivory Coast has become an overseas territory in Jacques Chirac's head, suggesting that the ongoing Operation Leone was as much an exercise in neocolonialism as it was a peacekeeping action. Documents released by WikiLeaks support this view to an extent. In 2005, a telegram was sent from the United States Embassy in Paris outlining France's bitterness over the situation in Ivory Coast, which was, in the words of the telegram itself, once a crown jewel of France-Afrique. The death of Houphouët-Boigny in 1993, one of France-Afrique's biggest advocates and beneficiaries, according to the leak, sent the situation into a downward spiral. The telegram went on to describe a unilateral military intervention in the old style, which allegedly cost France around 250 million euros a year. Others took a more pragmatic approach, believing that as long as French presence avoided a second Ivorian civil war, then perhaps it was justifiable. There was hope for ongoing, if fragile, peace, but these hopes would prove futile in November 2010. As polls closed on the first round of presidential elections on October 31st, 2010, no one quite knew what was going on. There had been significant interest in the elections. Turnout was reported to be around 80%, and several thousand expatriate Ivorians had cast their ballots from abroad. But no one could agree on who was in the lead. Some put current President Laurent Gbagbo in first place. Others placed former leader Henrique Nambedi at the head of the pack. Some news outlets pulled for ex-Prime Minister Alassane Ouattara. All the uncertainty would have been farcical if the mood wasn't so tense. The second round went ahead on November 28th. The following day, the expatriate ballots were counted and the figures were released. This early count had Ouattara as the initial leader with 6,371 votes to Gbagbo's 4,252, a tiny fraction in an election which millions of people had turned out to vote. But to Gbagbo's supporters, this was a big deal. They began to cry foul, claiming that Ouattara supporters in the north were manipulating the count. On November 30th, attempts were made to announce more results, but Gbagbo supporters sabotaged the press conference and destroyed the papers. Then things began to get even uglier. On December 1st, reports emerged of 8 Ouattara supporters allegedly shot dead in Abidjan, a city loyal to Gbagbo. With long-standing ethnic and political tensions not yet resolved, the Ivory Coast had been a tinderbox of simmering resentment and distrust for years. An attempt at a democratic process in 2010 had thrown a lit match into that tinder. Gbagbo declared his Ivorian People's Front Party as the winner. Ouattara proclaimed his own rally of the Republicans Party as the new governing power. Neither accepted the other's claims, and militants on both sides returned to the battle lines. Sporadic violence broke out all over Ivory Coast in the first 3 months of 2011, but it was Abidjan where it found its focus. This was Gbagbo territory, but the largest Ivorian city also had its fair share of Ouattara supporters. There were constant clashes as security forces sought to keep control of their main power base. Summary arrests, beatings, maimings, and even executions were reported as violence gripped the country. In the west of the country, the militias had been waiting for the chance to strike. In February, they took it, supporting the new forces of the rebels as they took Djoukwe, Daloa, and Zouan-Hunin. Throughout March, they pushed on, taking more Gbagbo strongholds and growing in power and confidence. By the end of March, the rebel army had a new name, Republican Forces of Côte d'Ivoire, or RFCI, and a new objective. The end was in sight, and one last push, they believed, would topple Gbagbo for good. On the 28th, the borders were locked down. On the 30th, the UN issued a plea for all parties to recognize the status of Alassane Ouattara as Ivorian president. On the 31st, Abidjan was surrounded and about to fall. Thousands of RFCI troops poured into Abidjan. A curfew was called, and UN peacekeeping forces moved in to secure infrastructure like the airport and hopefully to prevent further loss of civilian life. For several days, there was heavy fighting, most of it concentrated around Gbagbo's palace, where his elite units remained in place to protect their leader. Ouattara called upon Gbagbo's troops to let down their arms and join their brothers. Some did, but others remained at their posts. By April 5th, the UN and French troops had begun firing on Gbagbo positions in an attempt to bring the situation to an end. By now, there was little left of Gbagbo's army, but the president was still holed up in his residence under siege on all sides. He held out for almost another week before Ouattara's men stormed the palace on April 11th, aided by French helicopters and armoured vehicles. Gbagbo and around 50 others were arrested. The Second Ivorian Civil War was over. The first conflict had raged for 4 years. This one only 4 months. And yet, this was still plenty of time for fighters to make their bloody mark upon the nation, and particularly upon its civilian population. Around 1,000 civilians were reported murdered in Jukwe, with both Ouattara's and Gbagbo's forces blamed. Liberian militias in the west of the country were accused of murdering some 40 people whose bodies were recovered from Bleulequin in the final days of the war. Another 60 bodies were found at Giglo, victims of a power struggle that had almost nothing to do with them. Mass graves were also uncovered at Tuleple. A war does not need to be long and drawn out to exact a heavy toll on civilians. The grim scenes of the Second Ivorian Civil War shocked many international observers. Although his RFCI forces were far from blameless, Ouattara did gain the benefit of global support as the conflict reached its bloody conclusion, and he was soon proclaimed Ivory Coast's new leader. In the aftermath of the Second Civil War, there have been attempts at healing in Ivory Coast. Alassane Ouattara won a second election and then controversially fought and won a third, despite some claiming this to be unconstitutional. As of 2023, he remains as president of Ivory Coast, 13 years after the disputed elections that launched the horrors of 2010 and 11. In October 2023, Ouattara won a landslide victory in the local elections and promptly dissolved his government, ready for a reshuffle that he hopes will consolidate his power. The next presidential elections are 2 years away, and it is possible that Ouattara plans to extend his unprecedented run of election victories with a fourth term. Laurent Gbagbo stood accused at the International Criminal Court, but was acquitted of the charges brought against him. In 2022, his associate, Charles Blé Goudé, also charged and acquitted at the ICC, returned to the Ivorian political stage after years in exile. The return of Goudé came shortly after a meeting between Ouattara and his former opponents Laurent Gbagbo and Henri Konan Bidé, for the first time since the elections in 2010. At the top political levels, it seems there's still hope for reconciliation. But what about elsewhere in the country? After all, it's civilians who pay the price for political posturing and enthusiastic generalship, and thousands were horribly murdered across 2 civil wars and decades of unrest. How was Ivory Coast's social fabric holding up more than a decade on? In those first years after the ceasefire, there was immense anger. Ivory Coast had been ripped apart. Concepts of Ivoite, or the so-called genuine nature of true Ivorians, coupled with the tension between southern Christians and northern Muslims, made for a horrifying situation. Reports of war crimes and mass murder abounded, and the desire for justice was strong. However, the need for political stability and a new dawn for the country proved stronger. Goudé and Gbagbo were both acquitted, and many others escaped justice too. Instead, a newly functioning political machine in Ivory Coast turned its attention to legislation and social changes, bringing an end to the contentious issues of national identity and status that had caused so much bloodshed in the first place. After a spate of Islamist attacks from groups linked to Al-Qaeda in 2015 and 2016, the need for a galvanized and unified national security response became clear, and a pragmatic, forward-thinking Ivory Coast began to form out of the ashes. Scars remain. We often hear of atrocities committed within living memory and the simmering resentment just below the surface. In Ivory Coast, these atrocities are not just within living memory. They're just a decade and a half old in many cases. The danger of renewed violence and rewind bloodshed remains real. There's a long way to go before Ivory Coast can truly consider itself healed, but its ongoing path to recovery has to be viewed in the context of a nightmarish few decades. Ivory Coast, as an independent nation, has suffered greatly. Is the pursuit of justice, or perhaps retribution, the right way to go? Or is it better to try and rebuild a nation that all Ivorians can live safely and prosperously within, regardless of whether they, or their parents, or their grandparents were born in the country? What do you think? What does the future hold for Ivory Coast? Let us know all that and more in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.